In 1987, a woman walked into a public health center in Guyana, Brazil, desperate for help. She was pale and weak, and she said a strange sickness was slowly killing her family. The official who saw the woman thought she was exaggerating, but just 24 hours later, he realized she was the key to solving one of the worst disasters in Brazil's history. From Ballen Studios in Wonder Why, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you enjoy stories like this, please sign the follow button up for a cannonball competition in the Limpopo River. This week's story is called A Change in Fortune. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Guyana, Brazil. Guarani was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area, but there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Dever, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat, but Maria and Dever made a great team. Maria liked to joke that, even though Dever was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Dever would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Dever had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Dever had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Dever scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story for him. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Dever's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lady D. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lady was the closest thing she had had to a daughter, since she didn't have any children of her own. It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Dever went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her in rooftop. Guarani's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, after a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Dever. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Dever offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest, and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and when she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs. But whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Devir's house, and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Lady, to come join them. But Lady was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Lady did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Lady threw up. Then later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now that included Devir, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of Devir's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and Devir. 2 of Devir's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed, listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then, she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. Devir wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus and, about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria drop the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that, right now, she just needed to see a doctor, but he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis. But she didn't know what else to do. So she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm on and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face. The more they talked, Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her. And then, she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Guarini, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. About an hour later, Dr. Ferreira arrived at the public health office. Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away, it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken. Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So, he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that one on, the exact same thing happened. The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings. After a few minutes, Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine. And that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Guarini could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands. and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Dever's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Dever working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Dever's hand, but Dever politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm. Dr. Ferreira looked at it, and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Dever's hand could only be caused by one thing, and it was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most. Dever told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning around 10, a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Dever said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Dever thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Dever examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Dever paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Dever opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Dever was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Dever. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Dever. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Dever was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. Dever was determined to continue examining the subject, so he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powdery. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all Dever knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As Dever told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, Dever shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors. And each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets Dever had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made Dever determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of Devair's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, Devair gave the capsule to 2 of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. Devair gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of Devair's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she became ill. Around that same time, Devair had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later Ivo's daughter, Lady, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then, immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. Devair also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told Devair she was taking what was left of the powder in the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag. Then she headed out with one of Devair's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrap yards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked Devair about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. Devair said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira returned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments. But without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that Devair found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high. They were literally off the charts, but the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder, that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Guarani's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devair bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic where the blue powder was first discovered was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Lady, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, Devair's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for Devair. While Maria's husband Devair survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. Devair died in 1994. 7 years later, on a fall night in 1998, a woman walked into her kitchen after being out all day and tossed her keys onto the counter. She glanced over at her answering machine and saw there was a light blinking, which meant she had a message. She walked over and pressed the button, and as the message played, at first it just sounded like static noise, or maybe somebody breathing heavily into the receiver. And for a second, the woman thought maybe this was a prank call, or maybe somebody had dialed her number by accident. But then, right as she was about to turn off the message, she heard screaming and crying, and then it all just went silent and the message ended. For a moment, the woman just stood there, shocked by what she had just heard. She tried calling the number back who had left this message, but it went straight to voicemail. And so, out of fear that this message she had gotten was the sound of someone actually being heard, the woman picked up the phone and called 911. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the follow button and all expenses paid vacation to a very special canyon, Bell's Canyon. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Saturday, November 14th, 1998, 35-year-old Sarah O'Rourke and her best friend, Laura, scanned the racks at a local clothing store in Howard County, Maryland. Sarah wasn't really looking to buy any new clothes, but she was desperate to distract herself from the horrible day she was having, and she hoped shopping might help with that. This was one of the weekends that her estranged husband, Lorenzo, had custody of their 1-year-old son, and Sarah hated every minute she was apart from her baby. Sarah and her husband were in the middle of a heated divorce and custody battle, and if she had her way, Lorenzo would actually never see their son again. Just then, Laura pointed out a shirt that she thought Sarah might actually like. "It would look great with Sarah's red hair," she said. Sarah forced a smile, but deep down, she knew that this retail therapy was not having the desired effect. Sarah continued to walk around the store, but she just couldn't shake herself out of her bad mood. And this frustrated her because she'd always prided herself on being this really upbeat, positive person. In fact, up until about a year ago, Sarah's life had seemed almost perfect. She worked as a statistician for the National Security Agency, or NSA for short, helping solve a range of information security issues for multiple federal agencies. Sarah had always had a gift for mathematics, and so using her talent to help her country was like a dream job for her. Also, at the time, she had begun writing her first novel, a murder mystery about a brilliant statistician who solves crimes. And she and her husband, Lorenzo, had bought this beautiful house in a suburban neighborhood that looked like something out of a painting. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and white picket fences. And perhaps most importantly for Sarah, she had become a mother. But soon after her baby was born, things at home had begun to fall apart. Lorenzo didn't seem to want anything to do with helping raise the child. So Sarah quickly felt like she was juggling this important government job with taking care of a newborn baby all on her own. Also, Sarah's family lived about 1,000 miles away in Alabama, so they weren't able to help. Luckily though, her mother-in-law, so Lorenzo's mom, had pitched in and began babysitting whenever she could, and also helping Sarah with cooking and cleaning. But Sarah's mother-in-law worked full-time at a retirement home, so there was only so much she could do. And no matter how much Sarah begged Lorenzo for his help, he basically just refused. After almost a year of this, Sarah just couldn't take it anymore, so she filed for divorce. However, as soon as she did that, Lorenzo suddenly began acting like he wanted to be with their child all the time, and so he made the divorce and custody proceedings very difficult for Sarah. Back in the store, Sarah's friend Laura asked her if there was anything Sarah wanted to try on. Sarah thanked Laura for going out with her and trying to help her get her mind off of things, but at this point, she said she just wanted to go home. Laura said she totally understood, and the two friends said goodbye and headed to their cars in the parking lot. A little later that night, Sarah opened up a notebook and her laptop on a coffee table in her family room and began working on her mystery novel. Then at around 8:45 p.m., as she was still hard at work, she suddenly heard something and looked up, startled. She held her breath, trying to be as quiet as possible, but she didn't hear anything else. Still feeling unsettled, she got up, walked down the hallway to her bedroom, and then crouched down by her bedroom. And there on the floor, she saw the large metal skillet exactly where she kept it every night. Living by herself with her baby made her nervous, so the skillet let her feel like she had a weapon close by when she went to bed. But as Sarah stayed there, crouched down by her bed for a second, she didn't hear any more noise anywhere in the house. And so, she shook off her nerves and decided to leave the skillet behind. She told herself she was just being paranoid. And so Sarah stood back up, walked down the hallway, and sat down in the family room, getting ready to dive back into her mystery novel. However, just moments later, she heard the sound of shattering glass. At 7:45 p.m. on the following night, Sarah's friend Laura got home after being out for most of the day. She walked into her kitchen and tossed her keys on the counter, and she noticed the light on her answering machine was blinking. And so Laura picked up her phone, hit a button to play back the message, and the automated voice on the machine told her that this message had come in the previous night at 8:56 p.m. Laura figured she must have missed the call the night before and just not noticed she had this voicemail before she went out earlier. The voicemail began to play, and at first all Laura heard was static, and she thought maybe somebody had dialed accidentally and not left a message. But suddenly, she heard heavy breathing, and then screaming and crying, and then the message ended. Then the automated voice gave Laura the option to dial the number of that caller back. Laura just stood there for a second, completely freaked out by what she had just heard. She snapped out of it and hit the button to automatically return the call, and when she did, it went straight to Sarah's voicemail. Laura's hands started shaking. Now that she knew it was Sarah who had left this message, it was like the urgency went through the roof. And so, she hung up and tried calling her friend right back, hoping maybe this time Sarah would pick up. But again, it just rung and went to voicemail. And so Laura hung up and immediately dialed 911. A few minutes later, a Howard County police officer pulled up in front of Sarah's house. He'd been out on patrol nearby when he got the call to do a wellness check at this address. The officer got out of his car and walked towards the front door. It was dark out, but there were lights on inside the house and also out in front of the house. However, before the officer even got to the front door, he froze. He saw that one of the front windows of the house had been smashed in, and there was glass laying all over the ground under the windowsill. His first thought was that he had just stumbled upon a robbery. And so, the officer quickly went to the front door and knocked, but he barely waited before trying the doorknob. When he saw it was locked, the officer quickly used a special tool to unlock it, and then he opened up the door. The officer stepped inside the house and slowly began walking around, calling out to see if anybody was home and keeping his hand hovering above his weapon. For all he knew, the robber might still be in the house and could be armed. The officer eventually made his way into the brightly lit family room, and when he did, he looked down at the floor. And as soon as he saw what was there, he turned and ran out of the house. He got to his cruiser, fumbled for his radio, and called for backup. It was close to 9 p.m. that night when Detective Nate Reading of the Howard County Police stepped out of his car and approached the officer who had first arrived on the scene. By now, this quiet neighborhood had come to life. Detective Reading saw neighbors standing on their porches, staring at all the police and first responders swarming outside of Sarah's house. Reading spoke to the responding officer who had come to the house for a wellness check. He was a young officer who now looked completely shaken by what he had seen inside of the house. Luckily, Reading, who was more senior than this young officer, had a very fatherly demeanor about him. He was tall and still, and always appeared to be in total control. He spoke in a calm voice with a Baltimore accent, and he was able to get the young officer to calm down and also give him a detailed account of what he had seen inside of the house that had Dean inside of the house that had shaken him so. After that, Reading told the young officer to just stay outside. And then, Reading put on his gloves and walked to the front door. Once inside, Reading went straight to the family room, and when he looked down at what was on the ground, it shocked him too. He'd just walked into one of the greatest crime scenes he'd ever witnessed in his many years as a homicide detective. A woman who looked like she was in her 30 seconds was covered in blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and the floor. But that wasn't all. The woman had clearly been hacked and stabbed at with a blade so violently and so many times that her head had nearly been decapitated, and her hands were barely connected to her wrists. Reading's first thought was that this had to have been a rage-filled overkill. I mean, several of the wounds he was looking at that had been inflicted on this woman individually should have been enough to kill her, but she had several of those fatal-seeming wounds. Also, a scene this brutal typically meant investigators were dealing with a crime of passion. Detective Reading saw a purse sitting on the nearby coffee table. He looked inside of it and found a wallet with a driver's license inside. Despite all of the blood, he could still match the victim to the woman on this ad. The victim was Sarah Rars. Reading knelt back down to get a better look at Sarah. He saw all the blood on her clothes and skin, and the blood on the walls and the floor had all dried. And Reading knew that the woman who had called police to do the wellness checks said she'd gotten a frightening voicemail from the victim, from Sarah, the night before. So it seemed logical to him, especially based on the dried nature of the blood, that Sarah had already been dead for 24 hours or so. Reading stood up, walked back outside, and joined several forensic technicians and police officers who had also just arrived at the scene. He told the officers to start by talking to the neighbors, many of whom were still standing around and watching from their porches, to see if any of them had seen anything strange or heard anything strange the night before. Reading hoped in a quiet neighborhood like this that maybe somebody heard the sound of that window shattering and came outside to take a look. Maybe they saw something. As the forensics team entered Sarah's house and began searching for prints and DNA samples, Reading also went back inside and began a full walkthrough of the house. And as he did that, he noticed that somebody had clearly ransacked the place. But Reading immediately thought this was all just staged to look like a robbery. It looked like a VCR had been pulled off its stand and stolen. There were VA chest tapes littered all across the family room floor, and the kitchen drawers had all been pulled open. But Sarah's purse with cash and credit cards in it had been left behind on the coffee table, and so too had her jewelry and laptop, which were worth way more than a VCR. And so Reading did not think this looked like a robbery gone bad. Also, the brutality of the murder itself backed up his theory. As far as he was concerned, there was no way Sarah had been killed just by some random burglar. After searching the house for well over an hour, Reading reconvened with the rest of the team. Forensic technicians had found bloody handprints on the wall, but those just indicated that the killer had been wearing gloves. But they did find several bloody footprints leading from the family room to the broken window and into the front yard. They would use these prints in the blood on the body walls and the floor to see if they could get any DNA samples that might belong to the killer. The officers who had been out canvassing the neighborhood said that, unfortunately, nobody had seen or heard anything strange the night before. In fact, nobody had even noticed the shattered window at Sarah's house until the police arrived. This surprised Detective Reading. I mean, this was not a neighborhood that experienced much crime at all. And so, he really hoped that somebody had heard that broken glass and maybe thought there was a break-in going on and went out to investigate. But clearly not. But even still, the forensics team had plenty of samples for testing and, because of the brutal, sort of rage-filled nature of the crime, Reading felt like he could start narrowing down potential suspects to only people who had a close, intimate relationship with their victim Sarah. Reading also knew there was another huge piece of evidence that was not in the house. The voicemail message that her friend Laura got that might have recorded her murder. As late night turned into early morning, Detective Reading arrived at Sarah's friend Laura's house. Laura was still wide awake, desperately waiting to hear any news about Sarah. And so when she saw Reading, she led him into her house and brought him into the front room. And when they got there, Reading just told her she should sit down. Laura sat down on the couch and began shaking her head. It was like she already knew what was coming. Reading told her that he was so sorry, but police had found her friend Sarah dead inside of her home, and she had clearly been murdered. Even though Laura by this point had sort of been expecting the worst, she refused to accept this at first. She said there was no way Sarah was gone. It had to be a mistake. Reading watched Laura completely break down on the couch, sobbing and just repeating that police must have made a mistake. He again told her how sorry he was, and eventually Laura did begin to breathe a bit easier, and she wiped the tears from her eyes. And then she looked right at Reading and said something that totally threw him for a loop. Laura told him that the police needed to arrest Sarah's soon-to-be ex-husband, Lorenzo, right away because he was the one who had killed her. Reading was used to victims' friends and families suggesting who they thought might have committed a murder, but it was Laura's complete confidence that just seemed strange to him. He told Laura that Sarah's husband Lorenzo would definitely be brought in for questioning, especially considering, it sounded like they were going through a divorce. Generally speaking, spouses and intimate partners were always the first suspects in murder cases like this. But Laura told him it wasn't just that they were getting a divorce. It was also that Sarah and Lorenzo were in the middle of this nasty custody battle over their child. And Laura said that Sarah was just plain terrified of Lorenzo. Laura told Reading that Lorenzo had been living with his mother since he and Sarah had gotten separated. But one time Lorenzo had shown up at Sarah's house and literally threatened to kill her. Sarah was so afraid that he would come back to hurt her and take their son far away from her that she kept a metal skillet under her bed as a weapon in case he ever showed up. Now, Reading would obviously have to follow up on this claim. He had no idea if Laura was telling the truth or not, but it definitely seemed like Laura was being truthful, and he felt like he needed to act fast in case there was a chance that Lorenzo really was trying to leave town and take he and Sarah's son with them. And so Reading asked Laura for her answering machine. That way, police could study the message Sarah had left her. Laura said that was fine. She got up, unplugged the machine, and handed it to him. And then, very quickly, he left her house with the machine and rushed out to his car. On his way back to the station, Reading called in to ask for any records they had on Lorenzo Rarus. And when he got back to his office, he found a file folder waiting for him on his desk. It would turn out Laura had been telling the truth. Sarah had called the police on her estranged husband, Lorenzo, a few months earlier, claiming he had threatened to kill her. Police had removed Lorenzo from the premises, and there was still a court order in place forbidding him from returning to Sarah's house. After reading this report, Reading didn't waste any time. He requested a search warrant for Lorenzo's mom's house, Lorenzo's car, and for Lorenzo himself. This warrant would allow police to demand fingerprints and DNA samples from Lorenzo. Finally, Reading sent 2 of his team members to Lorenzo's mother's house, where Lorenzo was living. They couldn't go into the house until the search warrant was granted, but Reading wanted to have his eyes on Lorenzo just in case he tried to make a run for it. By 10. Zaroam on November 16th, so the day after Sarah's body was discovered, all of Detective Reading's warrants had been approved. And so, even though he had just worked through the night and he was starting to feel exhausted, he still gathered up several members of his team and they headed to Lorenzo's mom's house. At about the same time, Lorenzo stepped out of the house and got into his car to head to work. But before he could make it down the street, the 2 officers who'd already been there staking out the place pulled him over and told him to leave his car behind, and then they drove him to the police station. Reading and his team arrived soon after that, and Reading had Lorenzo's car impounded for a forensic search. And then they headed to Lorenzo's mother's house and they knocked on the front door. Lorenzo's mother, a small woman in her 60s named Amelia Rarus, opened up the door. She was carrying Sarah and Lorenzo's young son in her arms, and she looked genuinely frightened. She didn't understand why there were police at her house, but very quickly Reading broke the news to her house. He told her that unfortunately her daughter-in-law Sarah had been killed the night before. Even though this is very abrupt and shocking for her, they did need to search her house and also ask her some questions. Gemini N, Oya Noi. Amelia stared back at Reading in total shock. She said that was impossible. Her son, Lorenzo, had just seen Sarah a couple of days ago to get their son. Reading said he was terribly sorry, but this was the truth. And then he showed her the search warrant and said they really needed to come inside. Amelia nodded, still in shock, and led them inside. And then it was like she was on autopilot and just asked them if she could put the baby in his crib. Reading said that was fine, and while Amelia sort of shuffled off, he instructed his team to do a thorough search of the house. A few minutes later, Amelia came back, still looking very confused and shocked, and she walked with Reading into the kitchen. Reading again apologized for the whole situation and for having barged into her home like this, but quickly asked her point blank if she knew where her son Lorenzo had been on the night Sarah had been murdered. She told Reading she had had a late shift at the retirement home where she worked that night, so she didn't know, but her other son, Mike, would know where Lorenzo had been, and so Amelia called out for Mike, and suddenly this man in his late 20s walked into the kitchen. It was Mike, and he looked just as frightened as his mother. He clearly had just been listening intently to Detective Reading and Amelia have this conversation about Sarah being murdered. And so Reading, who could tell Mike already knew what happened, he just asked the same question he had asked his mother. Did Mike know where Lorenzo had been on the night of Sarah's murder? Mike immediately stared down at the floor and just began shifting back and forth on his feet for a minute without saying anything. And then he looked up at Reading and slowly nodded and said Lorenzo had actually been home that night. In fact, he and Lorenzo had hung out together that night for a little while before Mike had to leave for a night shift at his job. Reading thought Mike seemed like he was hesitating as he was saying this, and so he couldn't tell if Mike was just nervous or scared, or if he was trying to hide something. But either way, Reading never put much stock in family-related alibis. Parents and siblings would often go to great lengths to protect a loved one, even if it meant lying to the police. And on top of that, even if this alibi were legitimate, Mike did not seem particularly clear on what time he actually left the house to go to that work shift, and so really, this alibi did not let Lorenzo off the hook at all. After that, Reading joined his team and searched the house. Nothing really jumped out at them. No piece of evidence that made it clear Lorenzo could be a killer, but they were able to pull some fingerprints, and they collected a number of physical items that could be evidence that might help the investigation. Later that day, Detective Reading returned to the police station and met with one of the investigators who had picked up Lorenzo. And this investigator told Reading that there was something really strange about this whole thing. He said that when he and his partner met Lorenzo, one of the first things they told him was that his wife had been killed. And Lorenzo reacted by bending over and heaving and sobbing. But then, when he stood back up again, it was clear he had not actually been crying at all. It was all an act. Now, Reading didn't want to jump to conclusions here, but it was hard to deny that things were really lining up against Lorenzo. He was already an estranged husband in a heated custody battle who had previously threatened the victim, and now he seemed to be fake crying at the news of his wife's murder. The investigator told Reading that Lorenzo was in an interview room, so Reading grabbed a cup of coffee and headed that way. And after a few minutes of talking to Lorenzo, Reading felt like his case was only getting stronger. The conversation they had was relatively short and to the point. Lorenzo said he was at his mother's house at the time Sarah had supposedly been killed, just like his brother Mike had said. Lorenzo also made it clear that, despite all of the custody issues, he still cared about Sarah a lot and he would never hurt her. But it was not Lorenzo's answers, or his sort of flimsy family alibi, that made Reading feel like Lorenzo was now definitely his primary suspect. Instead, it was Lorenzo's attitude during this short interview. Reading thought every answer this man gave him sounded smug and arrogant. When he talked about his wife's death, he didn't show any emotion at all, despite the huge crying display he'd put on for the other investigators when they first told him about it. At the end of the interview, Reading called in an officer to take Lorenzo's fingerprints and to swab his cheek for a DNA sample. After that, Reading wanted to keep Lorenzo in custody, but he didn't have enough evidence to do that, so he had to let him go. But Reading felt confident that it was only a matter of time before Lorenzo would be back at the station, back in police custody. On November 20th, so 6 days after Sarah's murder, her friends and family gathered at a local church for her funeral. And they were joined by people from the community who didn't even know Sarah, but who had followed her story closely on the local news day after day. Detective Reading and members of his team also attended, and it struck Reading that everyone who spoke at the service was so bright and positive when speaking about Sarah. Even though everybody was still in shock and heartbroken, they said Sarah had spent her life being happy and spreading joy, so they wanted to honor her by doing the same, even now at her funeral. But that was not the only thing about the funeral that stood out to Reading. It was common for investigators to attend funerals of murder victims specifically to watch how potential suspects might react. But Reading couldn't really fully do that because his primary suspect wasn't even there. Lorenzo and his family had not shown up to Sarah's funeral. About a week after the funeral, Reading was sitting at his desk, going over notes from the search of Lorenzo's mother's house. Nothing had really come from the search so far, and he was starting to feel stuck. He was still waiting on DNA test results from the crime scene in Lorenzo's car, and without these results or some clear evidence from the search, he still couldn't move in on Lorenzo or anyone else for that matter. Just then, Reading heard somebody call his name, and he looked up and he saw an excited officer flagging him down, telling him there was something he needed to hear right away. And so Reading followed this officer down a hallway to a small room where a member of the investigative team was hunched over Laura's answering machine. This investigator had spent days trying to break down the voicemail recording of the breathing and the screaming and the crying into small sections to see if he could isolate anything that would help. The investigator, when they saw Reading, waved him over under one the voicemail Sarah had left on the night of the murder and played it back. And when it reached a certain spot, the investigator stopped the message and looked at Reading like he had just discovered something major. But Reading just shook his head and said he wasn't really sure what he was supposed to have just heard. And so the investigator rewound the message again, played it, and then stopped it at that same point, and then did it a few more times, going back to the beginning, playing it, and stopping it at that exact same spot. And eventually, Detective Reading knew why the investigator was so excited, because in the middle of all the screaming and the crying they had just listened to, Reading thought he heard Sarah say one word, a name, Mike. Detective Reading quickly dispatched two officers to pick up Lorenzo's younger brother, whose name was Mike, and they found him at his mother's house later that day. Reading sat in an interview room across from Mike, just like he'd done with Lorenzo. But after only a few minutes of speaking to Mike, Reading felt like these two brothers could not be more different. Where Lorenzo had come off as arrogant and uncaring, Mike seemed shy and sensitive. Talking about Sarah's murder clearly upset him. Reading wondered if maybe Lorenzo, the older and seemingly more domineering of the brothers, had pushed Mike to maybe murder Sarah on his behalf. But Mike stuck to the same story he told Reading when they met at the house. He said he had seen Lorenzo at home before he headed out to work. After the interview, Mike agreed to provide some DNA samples, and he also asked if someone could drive him to work because he didn't want to be late. Reading said he'd be happy to, and before long, he was driving Mike across town to his job. And as they drove, Reading didn't push Mike too hard, but he did say he thought Mike knew more about the murder than he was letting on. Mike didn't respond. However, when Reading dropped him off at work, Mike stepped out of the car and then fell to the ground and started vomiting. Reading immediately got out and helped Mike stand back up and get him cleaned off. But as he watched Mike walk into work, Reading now felt completely sure that Mike, and maybe even his mom Amelia, were hiding information about Lorenzo. As 1998 approached its end, Detective Reading still felt sure he knew who the killer was, as either Lorenzo had done it himself or he had gotten someone to do it for him, most likely his younger brother Mike. But before New Year's, the detective got the DNA results he'd been waiting for, and nothing from the crime scene matched Lorenzo or Mike's DNA. This shocked Reading. He'd been so sure this case was just about closed. But without this scientific evidence, or any other real hard evidence to back him up, he couldn't do anything. So, Reading started to question his own theories about the case. Had he been so locked in on Lorenzo and Mike that he'd ignored other evidence? He went back to the beginning and tried to see what he could have overlooked. And so he dug into Sarah's job at the NSA, thinking maybe the murder could have some connection to her role there. It did seem far-fetched, but if she was involved with sensitive intelligence reports, he at least wanted to look into that. Reading reached out to a contact at the NSA, and they told him they would look into it. But within days, the NSA contacted Reading to tell him there was nothing they could find about Sarah's murder that seemed even remotely connected to her work. The fact that Reading had gone from feeling like he was close to bringing Sarah's killer to justice to feeling like he suddenly had nothing to go on started to weigh heavily on him. He began having trouble sleeping, and he also started seeing that horrific image of Sarah lying there in her house all the time. But no matter what avenue he pursued, nothing new turned up, and so now, this case, which had seemed like a slam dunk, started to go cold. On a night in January of 1999, 2 months after Sarah's murder, a 19-year-old sat in his car in the parking lot of a Baltimore McDonald's. The teenager pulled a ski mask down over his face, grabbed a revolver from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the car. He quickly walked across the parking lot, stepped into the near-empty fast food restaurant, raised his gun, and started yelling for everyone who was in there to stay where they were and for the employee behind the counter to hand over all the money from the register. The employee began to panic and couldn't quite get the register open, and so his manager quickly rushed to the counter to help. At the same time, the manager told the teenager with the gun to please calm down and that he would get the money out of the register. Just hold on. But the teenager kept waving his gun and yelling at the manager to hurry up. It was taking too long. The manager kept saying he was working on it, and then, finally, he opened up the register, at which point the teenager with the gun lunged over the counter and began grabbing the money. But at the same time, the manager of the restaurant must have done something to spook the teen, because the teenager fired his gun and the bullet hit the manager. The employees and a few people in the restaurant began screaming as the teenager ran out of the restaurant with the little bit of money he had in his hand. But the cops were already swarming. On an afternoon in August of 1999, so 7 months after the fast food restaurant robbery and 9 months after Sarah's murder, an officer rushed over to Detective Reading's desk and told him there was a phone call he had to take. Reading went to the officer's desk and grabbed the phone, and a detective from nearby Baltimore County introduced himself. This Baltimore County detective said he was pretty sure Reading had not heard about a Baltimore County McDonald's getting robbed at the beginning of the year. Reading sort of laughed and said that he had not heard anything about that. The Baltimore County detective said it was the craziest thing, but the person who had robbed that McDonald's and actually shot the manager of that McDonald's was a 19-year-old kid named Dale Tickles. This kid was in jail for the robbery and the shooting, and recently, he'd begun bragging to other inmates that he knew everything about the murder that had been all over the TV, the one where the woman had been killed in Howard County, Sarah. Detective Reading felt a rush and he almost didn't know what to say. He'd reached the point where he wasn't sure if he'd ever find any new evidence in Sarah's murder. Still, Reading knew that inmates often bragged about murders. They knew nothing about murders. They knew nothing about, especially if those murders had been all over the news for weeks like Sarah's had been. All over the news for weeks like Sarah's had been. The other detective agreed with Reading, but he said this was different. He was nearly positive that this kid, Dale Tickles, had been giving away details of this murder that police had never released to the public. Reading thanked the detective for the call and said he was heading that way right now. As he rushed out to his car, Reading felt more optimistic than he had in months, and he thought he might finally find justice for Sarah. And after meeting with the young inmate Dale, Detective Reading was sure Dale was telling the truth. He did know things that only the killer, or someone who had at least spoken to the killer, would know. It would take a little more time for Reading and his team to get the concrete evidence they needed, but almost exactly a year after the investigation began, they finally knew who had murdered Sarah Rarush. Based on Dale's interview, DNA testing, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what happened to Sarah on the night of November 14th, 1998. On that night, the killer sat in their car a few houses down from Sarah's. They slipped on a pair of leather gloves, checked the hunting knife sheathed on their hip, and stepped outside. The killer wore all black and they moved quickly towards Sarah's house, being careful to stay out of the glow from the street lights. They ran across Sarah's yard to a window near the front door, crouched down, and looked inside the house. From this spot, they could see Sarah sitting at her computer in the family room. The killer raised up their elbow and slammed it into the glass. The window shattered, and the killer unsheathed their knife, climbed through the broken window, making sure to avoid the shards of glass, and ran right towards Sarah. Sarah was already up on her feet, running towards the phone that was on an end table, but the killer grabbed Sarah and slammed the hunting knife into her back, just as Sarah picked up the phone. The killer kept stabbing Sarah over and over as she desperately tried to dial 911. She didn't manage to do that, but did hit a special speed dial button on her phone that called her best friend, Laura. The killer sliced Sarah's hand and she and the phone fell to the floor. The killer crouched down and stabbed Sarah in the chest again and again until she was barely breathing, and then the killer slit her throat. Sarah died there on the floor, but the killer kept digging into her neck with a knife as they grew more and more crazed. They stabbed Sarah's chest again, and then hacked away at her wrists. Finally, the killer saw all the blood on the floor and the walls, and they stood up and backed away from Sarah's body. They ran across the room, grabbed the VCR, and threw some VHS tapes on the floor before heading to the kitchen to throw open some drawers. The killer had wanted to make this look like a robbery, but even they knew this was a very weak attempt and they didn't want to spend any more time in that house. So they ran back to the broken window, climbed through it, and sprinted across the yard and down the street to their car. And to their shock, the neighborhood still remained completely quiet. Nobody knew, but they knew. The killer tossed the stolen VCR into the passenger seat, gunned the engine, and sped away from the secluded suburban neighborhood. The following day, they went into work at a retirement home and told the woman they worked with that the job was done. Dale Tickles, the 19-year-old who robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, also murdered Sarah. But Dale had no personal connection to Sarah at all. He just happened to work at the retirement home with Sarah's mother-in-law, Amelia. And it turned out Amelia wanted Sarah dead. Amelia never thought Sarah was good enough for her son, Lorenzo. She claimed Sarah was a loose woman and was having all these online relationships with other men. Now, even though there was absolutely no proof of this, Amelia still did not want Lorenzo to be with Sarah. And these feelings only got worse when Sarah and Lorenzo had a baby together. Amelia thought Sarah was a terrible mother, and so whenever Amelia would babysit, she would give Sarah all this unsolicited, extensive parenting advice. But Sarah often rejected her advice, and so Amelia felt disrespected and angry on top of detesting Sarah. And so, when Sarah filed for divorce and tried to gain full custody of her grandson, Amelia decided Sarah had to die. Now, Amelia knew she could not carry out the murder herself, so she offered Dale, the 19-year-old young man she worked with, $3,000 to murder Sarah for her. And Dale accepted. And for several months after the murder, it looked like Amelia might actually get away with it. Detective Reading had focused the bulk of his investigation on Amelia's sons, Lorenzo and his brother Mike. Reading had never even considered Amelia a suspect, and when no concrete evidence against her son surfaced, Amelia believed investigators would just leave the family alone and go down some other path. But in early 1999, Dale robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, got caught, and while he was in jail began bragging to other inmates about how he'd been involved in a highly publicized murder. When Reading and detectives from Baltimore County interviewed Dale, he admitted to killing Sarah. It didn't take long for them to connect Dale and Amelia through their work, and they also eventually connected a bank withdrawal Amelia had made to the payment she'd given Dale. And so it was clear she had arranged the murder. Police do not believe Lorenzo had any idea what his mother was doing, and although investigators were convinced Lorenzo's brother Mike knew more than he was letting on, it was never proven that he had any knowledge of what his mother had done. On top of that, the FBI later conducted a detailed analysis of that voicemail that had been left on Laura's answering machine, the voicemail that basically captured Sarah's murder, and they determined that the word Mike had not actually been said on the tape. It was just a sound that could have been mistaken for the name. And so, as a result, the district attorney's office focused their case solely on Amelia and Dale. Dale pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility for parole as early as 2024. As for Amelia, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. A quick note about our stories: they're all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.